Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's close to home for a lot of us: economic volatility. You know those wild swings from boom to bust that they keep policymakers up at night and impact all of us.
And you've provided us with a fascinating vessel for this exploration today, a new research paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's called, get this, Institutional Causes, Macroeconomic Symptoms, Volatility, Crises, and Growth.
Wow, that is a mouthful.
It is. And they even threw in a couple of insightful case studies for us on Ghana and Argentina, just to keep things interesting.
Case studies are always good, but you know what's really interesting about this paper? It kind of like flips the script on how we normally think about economics.
How so?
Well, we always hear about, government spending or inflation, exchange rates, all those things being the big bad culprits behind economic instability.
Right, the usual suspects.
But this paper suggests that those things, they might just be symptoms, not the disease itself.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what are they pointing to as the real culprit here? What's the underlying disease?
They argue that it's a country's institutions, that that very framework that their economy is built on, that plays a much bigger role in its economic stability than we might think.
It's like blaming a roller coaster's thrills on the wind when it's really the track itself.
Hmm.
Its design, its structure, the loops, that's really dictating those exhilarating dips and turns.
Exactly. So instead of just focusing on those economic symptoms, this paper goes straight for the institutional heart of the matter.
Love that. Get to the root of the problem. So how do they back that up? How do they make that connection?
Well, they took a deep dive into history, analyzed data from former European colonies to figure out, why some countries have been stuck on this economic roller coaster, while others have managed to build themselves a smoother ride.
And what did they find?
They found that countries with weaker institutions think, fewer constraints on those in power, a greater risk of those in power exploiting the system.
So a recipe for instability right there.
Exactly. And those countries, they tend to have much rockier economic rides. It's like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. Any tremor, any shift, and the whole structure is at risk of collapse.
Okay, so weak institutions equal a bumpy ride. Got it. But what does that actually look like in the real world?
But what's where these case studies come in? The paper dives deep into two specific examples: Ghana and Argentina.
Two very different countries, but both with histories of economic ups and downs.
Right. And the paper uses them to illustrate how those institutional weaknesses can play out in a really tangible way.
Okay, so let's start with Ghana. Give me the Ghana story.
So Ghana, when they first gained independence, they actually had a pretty bright economic outlook, believe it or not, comparable to South Korea's at the time.
Really? Wow, that's pretty surprising.
Yeah, similar GDP per capita, similar potential, but their paths diverged pretty drastically. And the paper points to Ghana's political landscape as a key factor in that divergence.
Interesting. So what happened? How did politics derail their economic progress?
Well, even though they had a unified anti-colonial movement, internal power struggles emerged soon after they gained independence from British rule.
So even with a common enemy gone, those internal divisions proved really hard to overcome.
Exactly. And that led to, a classic divide and rule strategy. The ruling party at the time, they strategically funneled resources, particularly from cocoa farmers, which were the backbone of Ghana's economy, to specific urban and ethnic groups who supported them.
So it's almost like those in power were using the economy as a tool to maintain their grip rather than a system to benefit everyone.
It's a classic case of a vicious cycle. Weak institutions leading to bad policies, further weakening the economy, and then in turn exacerbating those initial institutional flaws.
And tragically, as you mentioned, Argentina tells a similarly cautionary tale. I mean, they're often seen as the poster child for economic mismanagement, always those booms and busts, often blamed on reckless government spending.
Yeah, they seem to be in this perpetual cycle of economic highs and lows, always trying to find their footing.
Right. And while those policy choices certainly played a role, this paper suggests we need to dig a little deeper, look at the root of those decisions. And what they found is that those seemingly reckless economic policies were often a symptom of that deeper ailment, weak institutions that allowed powerful interest groups to kind of bend the rules in their favor, even if it meant harming the nation's economic well-being as a whole.
Yeah, and the paper highlights a really stark example of this in Argentina. their political system. It's deeply unbalanced, arguably one of the most malapportioned globally.
Malapportionment. So we're talking about like different parts of the country operating under different sets of rules.
Exactly. It's like imagine certain regions having way more political power than their population would suggest.
So their vote counts for more, even if they represent a smaller slice of the population.
Exactly. And this means that policies are often crafted to favor those specific areas, even if it's not in the best interest of the country as a whole.
It's like one part of the country is calling all the shots,
Yeah.
even if those shots are way off target for the rest of the nation.
Exactly. And what makes it worse is this wasn't random. It was actually, according to the paper, strategically intensified by those in power, to consolidate their own grip on power and solidify those institutional weaknesses. They created the situation where inefficient and and some would argue unfair redistribution of wealth wasn't just possible, it was politically advantageous.
So it's a system rigged for instability, where those at the top benefit from the economic roller coaster, even as they make the ride for everyone else a whole lot bumpier.
Exactly. And it's not just those everyday policy decisions that are impacted.
Right, right. This has long-term consequences.
Exactly. Think about like the Argentinian crisis that everyone remembers, the one that was attributed to the collapse of their currency board when they tied their currency to the US dollar back in the day.
Right, right. Trying to gain credibility with the international markets, stabilize their currency.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember at the time, like, I thought the idea was supposed to help curb inflation, right?
It was. And initially it did. It actually
Yeah.
did help to curb inflation. But as the paper reveals, it also created this system uh, where certain groups, particularly those in less economically developed but politically powerful regions, were actually insulated from the worst of the crisis.
So while the rest of the country was really, really struggling, these groups were kind of shielded from the fallout.
Yeah, it's a stark example of how those institutional flaws that we've been talking about, how they can play out in the real world, not just in theory.
Yeah, it really underscores that core argument of the paper, right? That those macro level economic issues, the volatility, the crises, they're often rooted in this much deeper institutional illness.
It's like a doctor just treating a fever without actually addressing the underlying infection.
Oh, I like that.
You can mask the symptoms, but the problem's still
The
there.
problem's festering.
Exactly.
So how did the researchers actually connect those institutional weaknesses to economic volatility? They presented some pretty compelling evidence, didn't they?
Yeah, they really did. And they did it they dug into the historical data. They used European settler mortality rates in former colonies
Mm.
as a proxy for institutional strength.
Wait, settler mortality. How does that even relate to a country's institutions?
It's a clever connection. Think of it this way, in places where there were high death rates for European settlers
Yeah.
due to things like malaria or yellow fever.
Right, those tropical diseases.
Exactly. Europeans, they were less likely to settle permanently in those places, less likely to establish, those really fair, equitable systems of governance. Their focus really shifted to resource extraction. Get in, get the resources, and get out.
So it was less about like building a society and more about like
Exactly.
grabbing what they could and getting out as quickly as possible.
Which often led to, the formation of these extractive colonial institutions. They were designed to funnel wealth back to the colonial power, not really to benefit the colony itself.
Mm.
And those institutions, unfortunately, they cast a long shadow. They had an impact on these countries even long after they gained independence.
So places where Europeans could like settle comfortably, they were more likely to develop, stronger, more equitable institutions from the get-go.
Precisely. Think about places.
They kind of built their own mini Europes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those regions, they developed those robust institutions and generally more stable economies over time.
Okay, so high settler mortality, weak institutions, more volatility, low settle mortality, strong institutions, less volatility. That's a pretty bold link to make. Did the data back it up though?
It did. It did quite convincingly, actually. They found a strong correlation between those historical mortality rates and modern-day economic volatility. So those former colonies, the ones with the higher settler mortality over a century ago, they're much more likely to experience those wild economic swings today.
And they weren't just looking at overall growth rates, were they?
No, they dug a little deeper. They analyzed like the severity of economic crises.
So like the biggest drops in output, things like that.
Exactly. And even average economic growth over time. And across the board, the results were pretty consistent. Those weaker institutions, the ones often rooted in those colonial legacies, they were correlated with with poorer economic performance overall. And importantly for our discussion, greater instability.
So it's not just that these countries are economically disadvantaged, it's that their economies are inherently less predictable.
Yes, more prone to those dramatic booms and
Like
busts.
they're always on edge.
Right.
So how do you even begin to like untangle all those threads? How do you isolate the impact of institutions from, all the other factors that could be at play?
Well, it's a challenge. But the researchers in this case, they used statistical techniques to control for a whole range of other factors. Yeah. So they factored in things like initial income levels, education levels, financial development, even the types of goods of country exports.
Just to make sure they weren't biasing the results in any way.
Exactly. They want to isolate the effect of institutions themselves.
So did those other factors, like, did they make a difference? Did that link between institutions and volatility, did it hold up?
So while some of those other variables did show a correlation with economic volatility, the relationship between institutional strength and economic instability, that remains strong, statistically significant, even after accounting for all those other potential influences. The paper's core argument, it held up.
Wow. So even after adjusting for all those other potential explanations, the data still pointed to institutions as this major driver of volatility.
It did. And perhaps even more intriguingly, they found that this wasn't just a developing world phenomenon.
Right.
Even among wealthier nations, those with weaker institutional foundations, they were also more susceptible to those big economic swings.
So it's not just a legacy of colonialism or anything. It's this fundamental principle that applies across the economic spectrum.
Yes, very much so.
Interesting. But if institutions are so central, then what about those traditional macroeconomic factors that we hear about all the time? Things like government spending, inflation, exchange rates. Surely those must play a role, right?
They do to an extent. The researchers found that countries with those weaker institutions, they tend to have, for example, larger government sectors, higher inflation, and more overvalued exchange rates. And this often reflects, those institutional vulnerabilities that we've been discussing.
Which makes sense, right? If there are fewer checks and balances on those in power, they've got more leeway to engage in those kinds of policies.
Precisely. But here's where it gets interesting. Even when they controlled for those macroeconomic factors, the direct influence of institutions on economic volatility, it remains statistically significant.
So it's like those macroeconomic policies they're like the smoke, not the fire itself.
That's a great way to put it.
They're indicators of that deeper problem, but not the root cause.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Now there was one exception: exchange rate overvaluation.
Ah, yes, the overvalued exchange rate. Always a recipe for trouble.
Always. The paper, it highlighted that overvalued exchange rates were very strongly correlated with economic instability, even when you account for institutional strength, which suggests that that while it's not the primary driver, exchange rate mismanagement can independently contribute to volatility.
So it's kind of a double whammy in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
Weak institutions make a country more likely to have that overvalued exchange rate.
Yeah.
And then that overvaluation makes the economy even more unstable.
Precisely. And this finding, this kind of underscores another really critical point. The impact of those economic shocks, it's not distributed equally.
Right. Some countries are hit harder than others.
Exactly. And countries with those weaker institutional foundations that we've been talking about, they're hit harder by those global downturns, and they're less able to capitalize on those periods of global economic growth.
It's like they're more susceptible to, whatever economic bug is going around. While those with stronger immune systems,
Stronger institutions,
they're better equipped to weather the storm.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it kind of raises a crucial question.
So if a country kind of inherits this, 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 the set of weak institutions, are they destined for like this endless cycle of economic turbulence? Is there any way to rewrite that narrative?
Not necessarily. This research, it isn't saying that institutions are set in stone, that they're, predetermined by those historical events. It's more about emphasizing the importance of understanding those historical legacies
Hmm.
and how they might still be, shaping a country's economic trajectory today. It's
Yeah.
about recognizing those echoes of the past, but not being, held captive by them.
So it's not about destiny, it's more about starting points.
Exactly.
You need to understand where you're coming from to chart a different course.
Exactly. And the encouraging takeaway here is that institutions, they can change, They can
Yeah.
evolve, they can strengthen over time, even if it's a gradual and often challenging process. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
But by understanding the profound influence of institutions on economic volatility, I think we can start to craft more effective strategies for promoting stability and sustainable growth.
So we've got to address the root causes, not
Yeah.
just the symptoms.
Exactly. Get to the source of the problem.
This all makes total sense, but I'm kind of wondering about the mechanics of it all. The paper mentioned that these institutional weaknesses, they're often linked to what they call state failures.
Right, right.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What did those look like, and how do they connect to economic instability?
Sure. So when we talk about state failures, we're talking about those really critical political breakdowns. Things like civil wars, revolutions, or even just periods of really intense infighting between different factions within a government.
So situations where the existing system is really on the verge of collapse.
Essentially, yeah. And the research, it did find a connection between those state failures and heightened economic instability.
Well, yeah. I mean, if a country is like struggling to just maintain basic order,
Right.
its economy is probably not going to be thriving.
Yeah. Exactly. But here's the interesting part. Even in the absence of those big dramatic state failures, weaker institutions, they still correlate with increased economic volatility. It's not just about those really extreme cases. It's more about this subtle, persistent instability that's kind of embedded within the system itself.
It's like this low grade fever that never quite breaks, and it's always keeping the economy on edge.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. And this leads us to, I think, a really crucial question. If those large-scale explosive state failures aren't the sole culprit here, then what other mechanisms are at play? What's happening beneath the surface to translate those institutional weaknesses into real-world economic volatility?
Yeah, it's a complex puzzle for sure with a lot of moving parts. What insights did the researchers offer into that?
Well, one theory they explored was that maybe weaker institutions, they make countries more susceptible to those global economic shocks.
So when the global economy takes a hit, they get hit harder, and it takes them longer to recover.
Exactly. But when the researchers actually tested this theory against the data, they were kind of surprised by what they found.
Oh, really? How so?
There was very little evidence to support it.
Huh. I would have thought that, being more intertwined with the global economy would make these countries more vulnerable to those kinds of external forces.
It seems intuitive, but the data tells a different story. They found no significant relationship between a country's institutional strength and its tendency to experience economic turmoil during during global slowdowns or even during those periods of really robust global growth.
So it's not simply a matter of just like being more exposed to those external shocks.
No, not quite. While weaker institutions do seem to make countries uh, more sensitive to things like shifts in global trade patterns, that sensitivity doesn't consistently translate into greater economic volatility.
Okay. So if it's not primarily those big external shocks, then what's the missing piece?
Well, the researchers, they suggest that the answer might lie in a country's ability to kind of navigate its own internal economic and political shocks.
Yeah.
Those smaller tremors that can kind of ripple through a system.
Right. Like those state failures that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And the data, it does show that countries with weaker institutions, they are more prone to to those kinds of crises.
Which, I mean, it makes sense if you think about it, right? If the rules of the game are constantly changing, or if there's just a lack of clarity or fairness in how those rules are applied, they're more likely to, to resort to more extreme measures to get what they need or to have their voices heard.
Exactly. And even when those internal tensions don't escalate to those full-blown state failures, even just the persistent threat of instability, it can create this environment of uncertainty that can be really detrimental to businesses and just hinder overall economic growth. It's like trying to build a house on unstable ground. You never quite know when the next tremor might hit or how severe it will be.
Right. Creates this perpetual state of anxiety. The economy is like held hostage to those unknowns.
Yes, exactly. But uncovering those precise internal mechanisms by which, weak institutions translate into that tangible, economic volatility, this is where things get, incredibly complex. And the researchers themselves, they acknowledge that, we're still in the early stages of really understanding this intricate web of cause and effect.
It's an area ripe for further exploration.
Yeah, absolutely. But the paper does offer some potential avenues for investigation. It could be factors like pervasive corruption, which erodes trust and undermines fairness,
Yeah.
or unpredictable shifts in regulations that make it difficult for businesses to plan and invest, or even just this fundamental lack of faith in the system's ability to function effectively and equitably.
Sounds like a tangled web of interconnected challenges, each one kind of feeding off the others.
Very much so.
So if we were to like boil it all down, what's the key takeaway for our listeners today? What can we learn from this research and apply it to our understanding of the world around us?
Well, I think the most crucial insight here is the need to kind of broaden our understanding of what drives economic volatility.
Yeah.
It's not just about those big macroeconomic levers that governments they often focus on. It's about delving a little deeper, recognizing the profound influence of a country's institutional foundations.
Those often invisible structures that underpin everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They shape, how those levers are used,
Mhm.
who benefits from the policies that are enacted and who ultimately bears the costs.
It's about recognizing that economies don't just exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
They're built on this foundation of institutions, and those institutions, they can either, foster stability and shared prosperity, or they can, amplify uncertainty and exacerbate inequality.
Very well said. And while transforming those institutions, it is a long and challenging process. I think this research really highlights its essential role in creating a more stable and a more equitable economic future for everyone.
That is a powerful message to leave our listeners with today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the institutional roots of economic volatility. And as always, we encourage you to explore the full research paper yourself if you want to take a more in-depth look at this fascinating topic.
And if you're interested in kind of further exploring this idea of how institutions play this critical role in shaping the destinies of nations, I highly recommend checking out Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. It's a really thought-provoking read that builds on a lot of the themes that we've discussed today.
Until next time, stay curious, deep divers.